me also do this. Just a moment to get this situated. Right. Okay, and here we have, okay. One more person joining us here, but okay. So yeah, who would like to say something about some of these maybe questionable practices, Jared, that you saw? So Jared, you want to go ahead, you can go first, and then we'll have Emily and whoever else wants to go. Yeah.
All right, so the first scenario I chose was the 1B one. Okay. This was the one where the researchers decided to do a field study on deviant behavior, and their choice of location was at the riot. After law enforcement was pressuring them to release information, otherwise they would be an accomplice to the crimes committed at the riot. So I said the ethical component here is simply where the researchers will be putting the confidentiality of their research at risk now, because they're disclosing the names of people who were involved.
Mm-hmm.
And
yeah, sorry, go ahead.
I said, I mean, I agree with them for complying, just because, as I mean, they were witnesses to a crime and it will compromise their research, but they had to understand the risk before going in.
Yeah, so that, yeah, that's yeah, you can understand why it would be a quandary. The researcher certainly doesn't want to get in trouble. Also, we have to assume that the researcher knows the identity of these people. I mean, they may not know who these people's names are. They just may be able to describe them generally. Here are their demographic traits, and not know their identities. And the cop may be assuming that they know something that they do not know. Now, if there was an informed consent that was given out prior to the riot starting, they do have some legal protections that the researcher does. So they can say, we've given informed consent. We're not supposed to divulge this. This is, you know, I'm going to have to keep this close to the chest. This is going to have, sorry, officers are going to have to go to the courts. You know, so it all depends a lot on what, if they knew the identity, if they gave informed consent, it made it confidential, like, you know, so all these sort of things. Because also, you know, some of this stuff could be anonymous, and the person say, I just don't have a list of names here to give you. I'm sorry. So good. Yeah, Emily, which one did you take a look at?
The one that really stood out to me was because, you know, as a college student, I know how kind of like frustrating it can be when we're forced to take questionnaires, and, you know, there has to be voluntary participation to, you know, help data. Otherwise, it's not going to be accurate data. And I know for a fact that the University of Scranton, this actually happened to me last semester, they withhold your final grade for 7 days if you don't fill out the course evaluation, which I kind of messed up, and like, you shouldn't be able to do that. And obviously, like, you know, I rushed through it and didn't give like accurate answers because I just wanted to get it done and turn it in. So
so this is, which one are you talking about? That, because there is one on here.
It's letter I.
Oh, it's I.
Yeah.
Yeah, research questionnaire circulated among students as a part of their university registration packets. Although students are not told they must complete the questionnaire, the hope is that they believe that they must. So yeah, this is an issue of they're not getting informed consent because they don't know whether or not they have to do it. You're also bringing up the issue of coercion, and so coercion is something that is supposed to be avoided, and that it could be well, if they never released your grades, then that would definitely be coercion. But they probably can get away from being sued in civil court because they give you your grades after 7 days. So that's I'm sure they've had a lawyer go over and be like, okay, you got to give them the grades eventually, but we can make them, you know, we'll make them kind of panic a little bit, and a little bit of suffering that isn't any undue harm that they wouldn't be experiencing otherwise. So that's probably why that's probably why they can get away with that, because they eventually give it to you, because that issue has been brought up at Marywood before, and a lot of faculty have said, no, I don't want to do that because that sounds coercive, that you just, you know, and you're right. The problem with coercion is even if they go through and do it, they may be ticked off at feeling coerced and give you BS answers. Because like, I don't know, I'll just whatever. Yes, this is all great. Everything was fantastic, you know, and you get useless data, you know, garbage in, garbage out. And you can't use that data for anything then. So good. That's one that is particularly relevant to your population, where you guys are going to be probably subject to that kind of thing. If not, you haven't already, then at some point in your college career, there's usually something like that that goes on in classrooms where you feel like, well, do I have to do this? Where it's not grade bearing, so it feels like, well, what in the world? What other ones? Anybody? Yeah, Rebecca, and then Tyler.
I did scenario I too, but I just wanted to add that I think it's like equally unacceptable. Like, even though they didn't tell people that it was required, they kind of hoped they would believe that. So I feel like it's just as bad.
Yeah, you have to. I think that's all falls under informed consent. You have to tell people that this is not. Most all informed consent will say this is voluntary. You have to use the word voluntary in there. And this is one of the things. I'm on the IRB board at Marywood, and that's something we always look for is informed consent. We want to read that letter. It has to say literally, this is a voluntary study. You're under no obligation to complete this, because students feel like they're a captive audience. You're so used to being given things in classroom, being told, well, you've got to do this. This is part of, you don't do it, you're going to get a bad grade. And so you can understand why a student might feel kind of psychologically they're stuck in that same mode. And they might feel like, well, I'm not being told I have to do it, but I better assume that I have to do it because I don't want this to somehow, even though it probably won't, somehow affect my grade or reflect upon me negatively. So yeah, that's a problem when you don't have that clearly spelled out in an informed consent letter. So yeah, that's one of the things we always look for. Yeah, Tyler.
So one of them I looked at was letter A. So that's where the psychology instructor used the class's questionnaire as like the substance for the journal article that they were going to post, like for publishing for themselves. And I mean, that's kind of, I didn't agree with that. I thought it kind of just, as a class, you should be able to like trust your instructor. And I don't know if he disclosed what he was like using the questionnaire for, like told them, but it's kind of like borderline plagiarism, I would assume too, right? If he's publishing it on like an official scale or something, but
yeah, if you go public with findings, sorry, go ahead. I'm sorry, I don't mean to cut you off.
I just thought it was deceitful and just didn't agree with it.
Yeah. Now, if you go forward and publish it where somewhere the whole world can see, you had to have gone through an IRB process. You can do that, and you'd have to get informed consent from your students then that this is what's happening. We recently published research using self-report surveys from Marywood students. It's about a very sensitive topic. It's about how people react when they're told by their friends, I was sexually assaulted. And so it's not about the victim themselves, it's about how people react to this. And so we had to go through this IRB process. And so this doesn't sound maybe as kind of a sensitive topic as that, but we're not given enough information in this question to know whether or not this person, the psychology instructor, went through the IRB process. And so it doesn't say that, so we shouldn't assume that they did. On the other hand, though, if you don't make this public, and I've done this before in other classes, like we have no intention to publish this in a journal anywhere, and it's just strictly for classroom purposes. If it's that, then we don't have to go through the IRB, because I've had this with graduate. They go out and they collect some data, or they interview one another and they just put together a little data set, and it's just for classroom purposes. Never will anybody else, it'll never see the light of day beyond the classroom. So that's different. You can get away with stuff without going through the IRB if you don't publish it now. But if you do go and publish it, then that's where you can get in some legal trouble. So yeah, good. What else? Anybody else have some other ones? Yeah, Anthony, and then Mike, and then Brianna. Okay.
So one of the ones that I chose was C, and in that one, the researcher conducted a survey of about 2,000 people, and then went to publish the results in a book, but found that 25 of the interviewers, their information was falsified. So he just left it out entirely and then published the book. And I said that that's unethical, because you have to disclose all of your findings in the final publication. Yeah, very good. Yeah, you have to. That one of the biggest comments that I have received when I've tried to publish things is, well, what did you do with the missing data? Because you guys know, if you've ever worked with any big data set, like I use the AdHealth data set, not every single kid in that data set provided complete answers. And so you'll have a lot of your
sometimes not a lot, sometimes it's, just a less than 1%, but sometimes it's more than that. And researchers, if you just list-wise delete them, you have to say that. You have to say, well, they didn't provide complete data, because I feel very uncomfortable like imputing data or making up if somebody left out their gender. I don't want to just assign randomly, well, you'll be a man and you will be a woman. Like, I don't want to do that. So usually what I do is just say, well, this small percent of people who did not include their gender are unfortunately not going to be able to be in this study. They were not included in my analytic sample. But so long as you say that, then you're okay. It's when people realize, like, hey, we know this is publicly available information. There are, X number of respondents. We notice that really you're only using 75% of them. Where did the other 25% go? And if you don't disclose that, usually what just happens is that you will get chastised by people who are reviewing it and say, you got to disclose that. And that usually ends there. They have to do it. And if they continue to not do it, then the editor says, well, I'm not going to publish this because you're not shooting straight. You're hiding stuff, and who knows why they're hiding it. Sometimes people will hide things because if they're forced to deal with the missing data, their findings won't come out the way that they want them to come out. And so that's, that usually missing data, whenever that seems to be, that's revealed, and it's easy to, it's when you're using a data set that thousands of the researchers are using, it's easy to catch. But when people are doing these smaller scale studies where it's maybe just a few hundred people at a university, people can get away with lying and throwing out data that doesn't fit with their hypothesis. And that, of course, is not science. That's politics. That's journalism. That's weaving a narrative that just fits your worldview, and that's not what we're supposed to be doing. So good. Yeah, Mike.
So I used letter D, and it wanted to look at right-winged radicals for public opinion on something. And I just said that wouldn't really work if they were looking for a general public opinion, because obviously right-winged radicals would have a biased opinion that would fall to a specific side. So I said it would be unacceptable unless they were simply aiming to get the opinions of right-winged radicals. But it said public opinion, so I said it wouldn't be an accurate subgroup of the population.
There's statistical inferences problems with this. First off, so if you are taking, if you want to make general statements about the population, but you're only taking a sample of right-wing radicals, clearly that's not going to work. But also, it looks like they didn't really give them an accurate informed consent, because they said that they were selected at random from the general, implying they were selected at random from the general population rather than being selected because of their affiliation with a right-wing group. Now, if they just come out and say, we are interested in you because of your political views, and we think it's very important. We're trying to understand where you're coming from. That's full informed consent. So people know, if you're part of, the Proud Boys or whatever it is, people want to understand what is going on with this. And so long as the researcher says, look, I'm doing a research project on this, we would just like your unfiltered opinion on things, then that's okay. But when you make it sound like, oh, you were just randomly picked out of a barrel, you could have been, somebody from, you could have been in the Proud Boys, you could have been in Black Lives Matter. It's like, oh no, we're definitely going for right-wing people. That's where it becomes problematic. Yeah, good. Yeah, Brianna, you had one.
I did letter C as well, and I said how it was unethical. Like, I get that he didn't want to publish false information, but at that point you should say that there was incorrect or incomplete data and publish that rather than leaving it out completely.
Yeah. So this again, this is where, so long as you are transparent with what you did with the people you threw out, then you're okay. But see, it is a problem when people don't disclose it, because then you start wondering, why didn't you disclose that right off the bat? What are you hiding? Something, and it's usually not. It's usually nothing any more nefarious than the fact that the researcher, if they were to include that data or try to use statistical procedures to impute values for those missing cases, their hypothesis would probably no longer receive as strong support statistically as it did without that data. And so that is usually what's going on. These are researchers who are supposed to be scientific, but their egos and their biases creep in, and you can sometimes see that with missing data. And this is a larger problem really when you get into publications that never see the light of day, because they show findings that don't fit with the politics of the editors. So if you publish something that doesn't fit sometimes perfectly with the political views of these editors who are supposed to be objective and scientific and stuff, your stuff may get rejected even though it's methodologically sound. It's just you're saying things like, ooh, that does not jive with the zeitgeist, man. You're not, this is not what we're talking about. It's not okay to say these things because of just, the culture of it, and culture changes, the spirit of the times change. And so people's opinions sometimes are unfortunately not completely objective. They are sort of tracking with whatever is hip, whatever sounds progressive, and usually in the social sciences, there is this kind of progressive, more liberal bias. So if you say something that kind of comes off as too conservative, that's like, ooh, that's icky for some of them. And even though your science may be, spot on, that you're not fudging anything, they will leave you out of being visible to the rest of the public because they just won't publish your stuff. And so this kind of omission of things that don't fit in. Not because they're scientifically unsound, your methods are sloppy, it's because it just doesn't fit into the worldview of the flesh and blood human beings that are making decisions at desks that look no different than what I'm sitting at, like publish this, reject this, I don't like what this guy's saying because I think he's a conservative or whatever. That kind of thing happens far too often. Yeah, good. All right. What else, folks? Any others that people would like to talk about? Any of those others? Yeah, so good. So yeah, this is these are not always clear-cut cases. There is some gray area with some of these. Like they talked about, for example, that if you read the chapter about that tea room study, where this was a qualitative study of this guy that was interested in gay sex that's happening on the down low in these public bathrooms. And this guy would go in there and he would act like he's a part of it and say, I'll watch out. Will you guys get each other off? I'll act like I'm looking out for the cops. So you don't get busted for public indecency and sex in public. And some people say, well, the only way you could really study that kind of sexually deviant behavior, where sometimes it was straight guys who are openly heterosexual, but they had sex with men on the down low. That's what they call it. That you can't really study that kind of behavior if you come in like, hey, I'm so-and-so from, people are like, well, they'll just go away. Like, I don't know what you're talking about, man. I don't have sex with strangers in bathrooms. I don't do that stuff. So you'll never really be able to get it. So the people who are saying, well, the guy that did the teeth, I think his name's Humphreys, the guy who did this, and he was what was called a watch queen. So you watch out for people coming into the bathroom so these guys can have casual sex with one another. That people would say, well, you didn't. There's no way you could really do this if you gave full informed consent. And so that's one of these gray areas that continues to be debated. Like, if you want to study something that is hard to get at, that you come across as being too official, like, hey, I'm a grad student or I'm a faculty person and I'm doing this, that you may not be able to get to your the population you really want to get at. I can think of Patricia Adler. She was a professor. She still is, and she's got some hot water for other things. But she did this really famous study called Wheeling and Dealing, where she got in and infiltrated basically these upper echelons of drug markets. In order to do that, she had to party with these guys. She did drugs with them. And she commented how, yeah, cocaine really helped the interview process because people became blabbermouths. And so she's doing drugs with them and everything. She's not disclosing who she is, that she's writing a book. She's like, going back, still kind of high, like taking copious notes about what they were talking about. And so that, it's like, well, that violating any ethical rules? It's kind of hard to say. It's a tough call in some of these cases because people again would say, well, there's no way she would have been able to kind of expose what was going on if she revealed who she was right away. And so that can be challenging. But yeah, that's Patricia Adler, and that was years ago. I think it was back in the early 1980s, where she's out in California and she realizes the people upstairs
are not just casually smoking weed, that they're in the business. They're like moving pounds and pounds. They have safe houses and stuff of drugs. And so she had to infiltrate it, and she couldn't reveal who she was. And so that's kind of an ethical quandary. Okay, so let me, anything else that people want to share about that question? Okay, good. So I think the next one is not due until the 8th. So you got, there's another one that's coming up that you can comment on, but let me go ahead and share with you my screen. Let me get to this. Come on, don't cooperate. Okay. All right. Okay, hopefully this will. So yeah, this is still, I believe it's lecture 4, but this is talking about the rest of chapter 4. There are several approaches in the social sciences to collecting data. The sort of gold standard from which data is gathered, the experiment, the classic controlled experiment. We won't talk about that until a little bit later. In the social sciences, it's very difficult to do the classic controlled experiment, where you have a control group and you have an experimental group. Some of it has to deal with issues of ethics, because the things that social scientists are often interested in are all bad outcomes, like crime, victimization, poor health outcomes, poor educational outcomes. You can't ethically subject somebody to a situation and see if they're going to stab somebody. You just can't do that. And so because of that, it also tends to be no longer externally valid. And this is an additional issue. Like if you put somebody in an experimental condition, they'll know they're in an experimental condition. Do you think they're really going to behave the same way that they would out in public, knowing that they're in experimental condition? Well, probably not. And so for those reasons, the traditional, the classic controlled study, a controlled experiment, that is not done nearly as often as some of these other approaches in the social sciences that usually rely on some sort of survey. So probably the most common is what's called a cross-sectional study. Okay, a cross-sectional study is where observations are made at a single point in time. And so you take a large random sample of different populations, these are your samples, and then you make some comparisons between these samples. Or you can take a large random sample of Americans and you can say something about that. And in a single snapshot of time or a point in time, you can make inferences about that population. So an example here, if you look at a study comparing the truancy records of use in District A versus District B, you can find that District A receives more tax dollars than District B, and therefore can afford to hire better qualified teachers who develop better quality attachments with their students, who in turn are less likely to skip school. So, what is the problem with such cross-sectional studies when it comes to saying that tax spending affects student behavior? You might maybe want to shout out what the problem with that is. If you want to say that tax dollars causes students to drop out of school or stay in school, like why you can't really make that causal link using a cross-sectional study. Anybody maybe have an idea why that's problematic, why you can't necessarily say that just because tax dollars are different in these districts?
There's other circumstances that could cause those things that aren't directly related.
Yeah, like how about the students themselves? If the districts are not perfectly matched on student, like the family background of students, if students from District A have a different behavior record, a different family background overall on average than in B, then if you don't account for that, then you don't know if it's really the tax dollars that's doing it, or the people in District A would have behaved that way anyway versus the people in District B, because you're not accounting for these other things that may end up making the relationship spurious, right? So good. So anybody have any ideas? What may be a better way of researching this problem of students skipping school? And if you keep tax dollars in your answer, let's say we want to make sure that tax dollars are kept in the answer. Anybody have any ideas on what you might want to do? How you might want to better establish causation, a causal link between tax dollars spending and students staying in school or being truant? Remember, the cross-sectional study, it's just looking at this at one point in time. So with this one, if we account for rates of truancy between District A and District B at time 1, then we start allotting money, and then we look at time 2. Once we have accounted for the rate of truancy, we can see if the rates of truancy drop over time as money is spent. That is one of the ways that you could try to determine whether or not it truly are tax dollars that's making the difference, because you've accounted for the rates of truancy, and you see that the rates of truancy change in lockstep with the rate of spending, rate of tax dollar spending. And this, of course, is assuming that you really are kind of matched on other qualities. The best kind of comparisons like this are closely matched comparison groups. So you want to be able to compare apples to apples, as they say. Because if you get, if there are so many differences that could intervene here that could still render the causal link between tax dollars and school truancy as being spurious. Okay, so another type of study that is done in the social sciences is something called a trend study. And so a trend study does look at things over time, examines examination of changes over time in a characteristic associated with a population. So the census of 2010 to 2020 regarding the proportion of the population that is college educated. That's a trend. So you can see that there's a higher proportion of the population in 2010 and 2020 compared to 2010 that is college educated, for sure. The Uniform Crime Report, the homicide annual rate on crime, that you can see a trend of that. The FBI reports that. That's publicly available data, so you can look at that. But if you look at, for example, the U.S. crime decline since 1994, some people are absolutely shocked and in disbelief that the U.S. actually is quite a bit less violent today than what it was in the 1980s and the 1970s. That we have experienced what Frank Zimring, a legal scholar, calls the Great American Crime Decline. Starting sometime in the mid-1990s, homicide rates particularly started to drop. And a problem with trend studies, as the note says here, is that the trend itself does not provide an explanation for the trend. Like you can see quite clearly from the UCR data that there has been a decline in homicide, despite the fact that the country is littered with guns. And if anything, there are more guns out there than what there were in 1994. People are shooting at each other and killing each other less through gun homicide and other means too, bludgeoning people and stabbing people. That's all gone down. But a trend itself does not explain itself. So that does not provide a explanation. Explanations have been provided for this amazing decline. Some suggest that it's police are policing differently. Police are getting smarter, more police, which, knowing this, you start, pulling your hair out when you hear about people wanting to pull police away from high crime areas. Like, no, more kids are going to get killed. Don't do that's not the answer. And so we've generally speaking, the places, especially New York City, some of you know that New York City in the 1980s was, you would not want to go through Central Park. It was really nasty. Homicide rates were much higher, that and all kinds of other nasty stuff. But it's pretty safe. And that in part is because New York City is one of those cities that hired even more police than what was going on in other cities. And they had, and accordingly, a bigger drop in their violent crime rate than other cities, other large cities. And so that's going on. There was also suggested that there's just changes in the drug markets where you had the popularity of crack cocaine in some inner city areas because of all the stigma associated with it. People started moving away from that drug and the problems it caused. And others have pointed out that there are better economic opportunities for people who would otherwise be in places where there were no ways to sort of gain dignity for oneself besides like sort of gaining status in a gang. And so all these explanations are all plausible for why crime may have declined. It still continues to be debated, but it's not because there are fewer guns. It's not that. So this kind of, it begs the question of, how useful would gun legislation be really in affecting the homicide rate, because people who intend to do harm on other people with guns would probably go about getting a gun in illegal ways anyway. So that's a kind of controversial statement, but that's something we have to consider. And also people point out that homicides have declined even in areas without increased policing. So it may not be the cops themselves. Some have suggested, well, society over this period became more civilized. Like, we know we're more civilized than what our ancient ancestors were, but are we even more civilized than what our parents were? You talk about what the baby boom generation was doing in the 1960s and 70s. They were doing a lot of good things with civil rights, but also rates of violent crime were skyrocketing when they were young. And so, well, maybe my parents, might not your parents, I'm probably not too much older or younger than your parents. so really my parents, the baby boom generation. But yeah, they, the homicide rates, were going up as the hippie music movement was catching on. So homicide rates were also going up. And so civilization, we may have just been more civilized. Your group especially seems to be more conscientious, more violence averse than people just, 50, 60 years ago. Okay, so that's a trend study, and that's good for looking at population change over long periods of time, but the trend itself does not provide an explanation for the trend. It's just a trend. There is something called a cohort study. And this is an examination of changes over time in a specific characteristic associated with a specific group. And so a cohort, like you all are a cohort, okay? So you're all in common because you're all roughly equal grade level at Marywood University. So you're a cohort of college students at a private Catholic institution. So that's your group, that's your cohort. It could be people born in 1960, it could be high school seniors, it could be married people, war veterans. These are all cohorts. So at each time of observation, though, the cohort study will contain different participants. And so you could look at married folks in the 1960s versus married folks in 2021 and do comparisons on the likelihood of divorce for cohorts born in the 1960s, or not born, but married in the 1960s versus people who were married more recently, like in 2020, and see, how much the divorce rate has gone up since then. But you have a different mix of people in there. So the problem with that, well, let me not jump ahead here. Another example would be fewer high school seniors are smoking cigarettes than in previous cohorts. So we know this. So if you look at high school, there's a study called Monitoring the Future. And it surveys, like every few years, it surveys a large random sample of high school seniors. And over the years, a smaller and smaller percentage of high school seniors are saying that they are not smoking. And so, but what is this cohort telling us, not telling us about people and smoking? You might think what a cohort is not telling us about smoking, about the decline in smoking? Because it's a survey of high school seniors. I mean, there's a lot of things that it's not necessarily telling us. I mean, one thing, you don't know if kids are, the smokers are smoking up until their senior year and then they stop. And so the rates of smoking prior to that, when it's, it's truly seen as being cool to smoke among like 8th graders, if they're still doing it, but then they're stopping, that's not revealed to us in this study. It doesn't tell us exactly either, like a trend study. It doesn't say why young people are more adverse to smoking cigarettes either. We know there's less of it. It could be, well, after years and years of public advertisements saying that smoking is bad for you, people have finally gotten the message. And it seems to be anymore that there are fewer and fewer people across the board that are smoking cigarettes. It tends to be more limited to low-income communities, people with less than college degrees, where it wasn't the case back in the 1950s. Everybody smoked cigarettes. Everybody did, pretty much. I mean, that was just the thing that you did after dinner. After other things, or just casual conversation, people would ask for cigarettes. So this was something that has definitely declined in popularity, but we're not quite sure if students, high school seniors, are really concerned so much about their health, or just so that smoking is not seen as being cool anymore. I think it's more the latter, where most young people are not so concerned about their health because they are young and they have, on average, pretty good health because they're young. Okay, and then there is something called a panel study. So with a panel study, a panel study has some major advantages to it, but it also has some disadvantages. So the major advantage that a panel study has is that it examines the same people over time. And so, for example, with the Ad Health study, there was an in-home survey that looked at over 15,000 adolescent respondents and then followed up with 3, or now it's 4 more surveys spaced out spaced out by a certain number of years. And so you have people, the same people, being interviewed at time 1, at time 2, at time 3, at time 4, and now at time 5. And so what you can do with that is look at changes among these people, and that will provide you with a better sense of what is causing what, because it's the same people, and the person at time A, if they experience this effect X, that you look at them at time B, and then you compare them to other people who are very similar to them in every way possible, except for they didn't experience the thing X. And if the people experience the thing X are more likely to have depression, report criminal involvement, report victimization after experience X, then you have a lot more confidence than you do with like a cross-sectional study that the experience X really did have an effect on that behavior. And so panel studies are really good for that reason. A classic criminological study using panel data that stretched over a long period of time, John Lobb and Robert Sampson's 2003 follow-up of a study of delinquent boys in the 1950s. So all these the boys that they all had in common was that they were all locked up in detention centers in the 1950s, and some of them. So they all had these shared beginnings, but they had very divergent lives. Some of them got their lives together, others did not, and it was just a life of just misery and crime and drug and alcohol abuse. One of the key findings of that study was that those men who married desisted from crime at a faster rate than those who did not. Even though they were all kind of bad boys, they were all delinquent, they all had problems. But what they found was no, it seems to be the case that marriage, at least for men, is an effective source of social control. that when men marry, even though they may have a rough background, the effect of a marriage, at least a stable marriage, one that's not rife with all kinds of abuse and things like that, that is something that is a catalyst for change for men that would make them walk the line, as Johnny Cash sung. So you can do that kind of thing with a longitudinal study. And so, how is this an improvement of a cross-sectional study of those married versus not married? Well, if you look at people who are married versus those who are not married, and then look at rates of crime, that may not tell you what the effect of marriage is. What you may be seeing is that, well, the guys who commit crimes also don't get married because they're not marriageable material. They may be fun for a hot date, here and there, but they're really not the kind of guys that women are going to be like, yeah, I want to spend the rest of my life with you. That's the case where you look at the married guys, that these guys are more conventional. They're not at the bar all the time getting in fights with people. They're not doing that kind of buffoonish behavior, but that doesn't necessarily tell you anything about the effect of marriage on behavior. It's just telling you that, well, conventional men do the conventional thing of getting married, and they also do the conventional thing of not getting in fights with drunken strangers at the bar. So that's why we want to do these panel studies when we can, because cross-sectional studies, while they have some advantages, they definitely don't have the kind of statistical ability to detect causal relationships between one thing and another thing. You just can't do it because of self-selection is one way you can think about it. Men will self-select if they're inclined to into monogamy and marriage, and they'll also self-select into conventional behavior that does not lead to crime and imprisonment. And men who are not monogamous and want to, kind of always be a player and never really grow up, kind of a Peter Pan syndrome. These are also the same guys that self-select into prison, so because of their behavior. So that is where the limitations of the cross-sectional study come up. Anybody have any suggestions as to what else we could examine using a panel study design? Just anything that you might think of, that if you could follow the same people over time and you had the money to do this, you had the wherewithal to do this, what would you want to take a look at, and how would you take advantage of a panel study design? So just take a couple minutes and think about that. What would you do if you had the money, you had the wherewithal, that is, you had the resources, and you had the computers and the ability to actually track down a random sample of people and follow them over time? What would you want to take a look at? Panel studies are time intensive, they're resource intensive, they cost money. You have to follow people over time. Cross-sectional studies are cheaper to do, and you can get a large swath of people in a relatively short period of time. With the Samson and Lobb example, that was a longitudinal study that went on for over 70 years. It went across generations of researchers. Literally, you had the Glucks at Harvard that first did it, and then these guys found the Glucks data in some Harvard basement somewhere. Like, holy God, look at this! This is a gold mine. And they went out and found these people again when they're old men. And they re-interviewed them. So that's the kind of thing you could do, but it's time intensive, it costs money, and you need like a whole research team working with you to do that kind of thing. So think for a minute what you would want to study if you had the time and resources to do a panel study, because this is about as close as we get to showing causation in the social sciences, because as I said before, a traditional or classic controlled experiment really does not lend itself to social sciences because of ethical reasons and reasons of external validity that get all messed up when you are performing an experiment on somebody and you tell them to act natural. So that can be a problem. So think about that. What else? What people who have not volunteered yet have not said anything, at least for this particular class. What could you do with a panel study that you couldn't do with a cross-sectional study?
I know that we were talking about it earlier, but couldn't you use a panel study to study the effect of education? Like do one when they're in like elementary school, another when they're in middle school, and then like high school, and then if you want, do another one in college, or if they don't go to college, then just wait until they get to like middle age or like 50 years old and see how everything compares.
Yeah, so certainly the effects of education on some other outcome, like earnings, occupational prestige, that kind of thing. I think we generally assume the more education, the more income, and more occupational prestige you're going to have. I mean, that generally goes. That's an assumption that is probably true. Do you have anything, Kyle? Anything in particular in mind that you might be thinking of that you might want to look at, like, you know, how far you go and what effect it has on some other life outcome, like something you're thinking of in mind?
Yeah, I was thinking more or less like kind of like what general area you would kind of end up if you go on like a certain track, that, or specifically you could use it as like more of an emotional standpoint. Like some people might go to college and be miserable, and some people might just go into high school, find what they want to do with their lives, and then just live their lives happily. Like it would be interesting to kind of see that over long term.
Yeah, I mean, the psychological aspect would be interesting. A lot of people are interested in happiness and it's really simple. People just ask, how happy are you on average, on an average day, like a scale of 1 to 10? And people vary. Some people are pretty happy. Other people seem pretty miserable. And there's a lot of us that are in between, but these things change over time. Generally speaking, people get happier after they get out of the really turbulent period of life. Like you guys will probably be happier, more satisfied when you are out of college and making money and feeling economically independent. That usually your happiness scores usually go up. But that may depend on how much schooling you have under your belt, right? You know, people who stick to it and go through the pain of going through college and even graduate school, that initial pain may pay off psychologically, and years down the road, that you just may feel like a more content, happier person by the time you reach 50 than someone who only completed high school or something. So that's something that you could do, but you couldn't do that. You know, cross-sectionally, the problem with that would be that, well, people that are dissatisfied and unhappy initially may self-select out of higher education opportunities. And so it's not really saying anything about the effect of education on happiness. The causal ordering can't be determined if you don't look at them over time. Good. Yeah, that's one possibility. What else? Anybody else have any other ideas here about all the things you could do with a panel study? And this is, this is kind of the best that we get in the social sciences. It's really hard, again, to do the kind of the classic controlled experiment. So the best we can do, if we have the resources, the wherewithal, is to go ahead and track the same people over time. And usually with the way these things work is that a lot of times you're asking them many of the same questions at time 1, time 2, time 3. So you can check to see, using the exact same measure and seeing if things change over time in relation to other things that you're also recording information on. Or you could look at knowing that certain events happened. What we're going through right now with COVID. Like, there are going to be long-term effects of this. You may get through this without getting it. You may not. You get through this without knowing anybody that has that died from it. But there's going to be long-term effects of this on people's economic outlooks that we don't really fully grasp yet. And so it'd be interesting to know how people are adjusting to this if you follow them over time and account for what's going on right now, and follow them up 2, 3, 4 years, 10 years later, and see how they adjust according to what they're experiencing now. That would be a good one, and that's one you could probably get some grant money for, because I think there's a lot of people right now. We're kind of like in triage mode. We're still we're still treating this and just trying to get this under control. So more elderly people don't have to die early. So that's what's going on right now. But it'll be interesting to know the other sort of less understood effects of this, economic effects, the psychological effects. I understand that deaths from despair, drug overdose, those are way up. Numbers are way up in 2020. So that's one of the things where it's got to be really careful with the lockdowns. People that are prone to abusing drugs and alcohol. This has not been good for them. It's been really bad. You got to, you have to find some other outlet, but it's really hard for some people. They've had that habit previously, and now it's like, oh no, everything that kind of gave my life meaning, that kept me from drinking so heavily, now I can't do that. That can be really challenging for people. So kind of stuff like that, we'd like to know what the effects of this are on people over the long term. Accounting for individual differences at the beginning and then tracking them over time and seeing how they change accordingly. Okay, any other comments about this panel study, about what one could do with a panel study that may be really challenging, or you may not be able to get a satisfactory causal explanation out of a cross-sectional study. Cross-sectional studies are much easier to do, but the trade-off here is that you can't show causation in them, not nearly to the same degree that you can in a panel study. It should be not what, it should be why not always do panel studies. So why not always do panel studies? And I think I already said that these things are costly. You're following the same people over time. People die. Like the Samson Lobb study, these guys, some of them, many of them die prematurely. Perhaps it's no surprise that men and women who live criminal lifestyles also live pretty gritty lifestyles, in the sense that they don't take care of their health very well. They don't have the best diet. They don't do what the doctor tells them to do. They're non-compliant in lots of ways other than just not following the law. And so usually criminals will have, on average, worse health. And of course, they're also more prone to be victims of homicide and that kind of thing. So people can drop out of your study because they drop into the grave. And so that could be, you have to account for, they had to go through and search death records because, you need to account for, like, it looks like, well, this person is not in our study. This is a missing data case. Why is this person missing? Well, he's dead. He died of a homicide, or he died of he had a heart attack or whatever. So that, poor health and criminal behavior, those things are really closely intertwined. But again, the panel studies can be very challenging to do because the time it takes. You have to have really a dedicated person who's starts their career. Usually academics start their careers, sometime seriously in the mid-30s, and they don't really start publishing serious stuff until they get into their 40s. But then they have to keep doing this until they're past retirement age. I worked under somebody who did this. They just follow up these people, and these people, they watch these people age as they age themselves, and so it becomes this literally this lifelong thing to do one of these panel studies, and it goes across generations of researchers. Like, I pass the baton on to you to keep following these people, and so this is it's really resource time intensive kind of thing. Okay, anything else from anybody? Because that is, I think that's all I got for today. And so this ends with this first section of this course. And so it's chapters 1 through 4. The exam will be up on Moodle tomorrow sometime, and I'll give you a notification about that. So you can go ahead and log in. It's not a time test. It'll just be on a Word document. You just need to download the Word document, then complete it, upload your completed Word document. You can upload a PDF or a Google Doc. Just don't upload whatever Mac has by default, because my computer won't open it. You can always go, if you Google, I think it's called Cloud Convert, or you just Google convert Mac document to Word. You can do it for free. It's just a drag and drop thing. So it'll convert it for you. You don't have, there's nothing, or I think in Mac also there's an option to save as a PDF, and so it's readable by PC, but just do that if you have a Mac. Because I think it's it's called Pages. That's the program in Mac. So if you have Mac, please convert that into a Google Doc or a PDF or something like that. So you can convert it into a Word doc. But I think it's the best thing to do, though, is convert it into a PDF, because you convert it into a Word doc from a Pages doc. Sometimes the formatting changes slightly. Usually that's not a big problem, especially with an exam. But anyway. Okay, any questions or other comments? Because that is it for today. You all are free to go, and I will see you then all again on Tuesday. And so Tuesday, you can read chapter 5 in preparation for Tuesday. That's all for today, folks. Okay. All right. Bye-bye.